The men's laughter hit her before she even dismounted. She hadn't asked for much: a job, a place to sleep, chance. But the moment Mara Bellamy swung down from her rented horse in front of Redstone Ridge Ranch, 3 ranch hands stopped what they were doing and stared. Then one of them, a wide-shouldered man with tobacco-stained teeth, cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted across the yard, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Boys, looks like we're getting a new cook. Better reinforce the kitchen floor." The laughter that followed wasn't quiet. It rolled across the yard like a wave, and every man within earshot turned to look. Mara stood there, her worn travel bag hanging from one hand, dust from the road still on her boots, and she felt every single pair of eyes land on her body like a brand. She had survived worse. She told herself that. She just wasn't sure she believed it yet. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever stood somewhere and felt invisible, felt judged before you'd spoken a single word, then stay with me. Subscribe to this channel and follow Mara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next at Redstone Ridge will stay with you. Hit the like button and drop your city or country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The road to Redstone Ridge had taken Mara 3 days, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours of any of them. She'd left Calverton with exactly $11, a single change of clothes, and a folded newspaper advertisement she'd read so many times the creases had gone soft. Ranch hand wanted, Redstone Ridge, Harrow County, wages negotiable. No experience required. She had torn it from the board outside the post office on a Tuesday morning. The same morning her landlord had left a notice on her door. The same morning the laundry where she'd worked for 2 years had closed without warning, the owner simply gone. The lock changed, 43 workers standing outside in the cold, wondering what had happened to the wages they were owed. Mara was 26. She was not small. She never had been, and she had stopped apologizing for it somewhere around age 17, when she understood that the apology would never be enough anyway. She was broad-shouldered and solid, with hands that had calloused early from hard work, and she moved through the world with the particular economy of someone who had learned not to waste motion. She wasn't graceful. She wasn't soft-spoken. She had a temper she kept on a tight leash, and she had a stubborn streak that had cost her more than one job and more than one friendship, though she'd never quite decided whether that was a flaw or the only thing that had kept her alive. She had no family left to speak of, a mother who had died when Mara was 14, a father who had remarried and moved east and sent a letter twice a year that said very little and meant less. No sisters, no brothers, an aunt in Prescott who had taken her in for 2 years after her mother passed, a woman who was kind enough but had her own 4 children, and a husband who made it clear Mara was a burden, not a guest. She had left at 16 and not gone back. So when the laundry closed and the rent notice appeared, and the $11 sat in her hand like a verdict, she had done what she always did when the ground gave out beneath her. She moved. Redstone Ridge was 7 miles outside the town of Harrow, up a road that turned to dirt after the first mile and stayed that way. The ranch was larger than she'd expected. She'd imagined something modest, a few outbuildings and a farmhouse. What she found was a working cattle operation, spread across a shallow valley, with a main house that sat on a rise overlooking 3 long bunkhouses, 2 barns, a cook shack, and a series of corrals that stretched out toward the eastern tree line. Cattle dotted the far fields, distant enough to look small. Place smelled of wood smoke and horses and turned earth. And despite everything, despite the ache in her legs and the dryness in her throat, and the fact that she'd had nothing but hard bread and creek water since morning, something in her steadied at the sight of it. Then the shouting started. The man's name, she would learn later, was Pete Dalloway. He was 34, built like a fence post, and had worked at Redstone Ridge for 6 years, long enough to believe he had certain privileges. The shouting was one of them. The audience was another. He had an audience now. 5 men had drifted over within seconds, drawn by the sound of someone being made a target, which was apparently entertainment enough on a Wednesday afternoon. "You get lost, sweetheart?" Pete called out, leaning against the fence post with his arms crossed, working his jaw around something he was chewing. "Dress shop's back in town." Mara didn't answer him. She tied her horse to the rail near the water trough, gave the animal a moment to drink, and looked toward the main house. "Hey," he pushed off the fence and walked closer, not threatening exactly, but close enough to make a point. "I'm talking to you." "I know," she said. "I'm choosing not to answer." That got a reaction she hadn't expected. Not anger, not immediately. First surprise, his mouth closed. Then, around her, a couple of the men shifted, and one of them younger, maybe 20, with a sunburned nose made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly converted into a cough. Pete's expression went flat. You here to see someone? I'm here about the position. Silence. Not the ordinary kind of silence where a conversation pauses. The kind where a group of people collectively decides how to respond to something they consider absurd. It stretched for 3 full seconds, and then Pete Dalloway threw his head back and laughed. The others followed, and the sound of it hit the open air and spread. The ranch hand position, he said, like he was clarifying something for a child. The one that involves cattle and rope and horses and riding hard in weather that'd make a grown man want to quit. Yes, Mara said, that one. He looked her up and down. He made no effort to disguise it. His eyes traveled from her boots to her face and back again, and the contempt in them was unhurried, deliberate, the kind that came from a man who had never once been told his opinion was unwelcome. Go home, he said, whatever home looks like. Mara's jaw tightened. It was the only sign. I'd like to speak with the owner. Owner's busy. Then I'll wait. Pete stepped closer. He was trying to use the space between them as a kind of pressure, and she recognized it immediately. She'd grown up around men who did that. She didn't step back. Lady, he said, lowering his voice now, which was worse somehow than the shouting. You don't want to do this. You'd be dead weight in 3 days. You'd be crying in your bunk by Thursday. I'm telling you this as a kindness. You're telling me this, she said quietly, because you're enjoying yourself. His face changed. She turned away from him and walked toward the main house. She heard one of the men say, behind her, low and flat, she won't last the week. And she heard Pete answer, she won't last the afternoon. The main house door was answered by a woman in her 50s with iron gray hair pinned back hard and the expression of someone who had seen every kind of fool and had stopped being surprised by any of them. She looked at Mara for a moment, then stepped aside without a word and led her down a short hall to a room that served as an office, a heavy desk, a wall of account ledgers, a window that looked out over the Western Corral. Cole Mercer was standing at that window when she came in. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean without being slight, with the kind of weathered stillness that came from spending most of your life outdoors. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of growth, and he was reading a piece of paper that he folded and set on the desk without particular hurry when Mara entered. He looked at her, not the way Pete had looked at her. There was no inventory in it, no verdict being assembled. He just looked, the way a person looks at something they're genuinely trying to understand. You're here about the position, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, you've already talked to the men outside. One of them talked at me, she said. There's a difference. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, not quite. Pete Dalloway. I didn't get his name. Big loud. Thinks he runs the place. That one, yes. Cole walked around the desk and sat on the edge of it, not behind it, which she noticed. He studied her for another moment. You have any experience with cattle? Some. I worked on my uncle's farm for a summer when I was 15. Hogs mostly, but cattle too. That's not much. No, she agreed. It's not. You ride? Well enough to get here. That's also not much. I know, she didn't flinch from it. But the advertisement said no experience required. And I can work. That's not a brag, Mr. Mercer. It's the one thing I know for certain about myself. I can work harder and longer than most people expect. And I don't quit when it gets uncomfortable. He was quiet. Outside, through the window, she could see the men in the yard. Pete Dalloway had gone back to the fence. He was watching the house. Those men will make it difficult, Cole said. Not might. Will, I'm aware. Not just uncomfortable, difficult. Also aware. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers once, then set it down. Why here? There's a hotel in Harrow, a laundry, a dressmaker's. I wasn't asked to leave those places, she says, because of what I looked like. I was asked to leave, or in the laundry's case, simply locked out because there was no room. No room that was offered to me. She paused. I'd rather be somewhere that says it doesn't care about experience than somewhere that says it doesn't care about looks and then proves otherwise. Cole looked at her for a long moment. 1 week, he said. I'll give you 1 week. You pull your weight, you stay. You can't, you leave without argument. Agreed. You'll bunk in the supply room off the cook shack. There's a cot and a window. It's not much. It's more than I had this morning. Stood. Don't let Pete Dalloway get inside your head. He's good at it. He's already tried, she said. He's not as good as he thinks he is. This time Cole did almost smile, almost. The supply room was exactly as described: a cot, a window, a smell of dried beans and old leather, and not much else. Mara sat on the edge of the cot that evening and let herself have 5 minutes. Just 5. She allowed herself to feel the full weight of what the last week had been: the locked laundry door, the rent notice, the 3-day road, the laughter in the yard, and then she folded it up and put it somewhere she could get to later. Or maybe never, and she went to the cook shack to see about supper. The cook was a heavy-set man named Virgil, who wore an apron that had not been washed recently, and who looked at her with the wary expression of someone told to expect trouble. "You're the new one," he said. "Mara Bellamy, Virgil Oakes." He handed her a plate without ceremony. "Sit where there's room." The cook shack had a long table and 2 benches, and there was room everywhere, because the men had arranged themselves in a way that left one end conspicuously empty. She sat at the empty end. She ate. The food was plain beans, salt pork, cornbread, and it was the best thing she had tasted in 3 days. Pete Dalloway came in late, which she suspected was intentional. He sat down at the far end with his group, and within 2 minutes the conversation had turned to something that was clearly meant for her to hear. She did not look up. "You know what's funny?" Pete said, at a volume calibrated for the whole room, "is a woman who walks onto a cattle ranch and thinks she's going to ride drive. I've seen grown men wash out first week, men who grew up ranching." He paused. "No offense to Milo's cousin who lasted 4 days. Laughter. "None taken," said a voice she'd come to know as Milo, a compact man with a red kerchief who'd been at least quieter than the others. Mara chewed her cornbread and said nothing. "I give her to Thursday," Pete continued. "Generous estimate. Blisters alone'll do it." She set down her fork. She looked at him directly for the first time since the yard. "What's the bet?" she said. Pete blinked. "If you're making one," she said, "I'd like to know the terms." He stared at her. Then slowly the grin came back. $5 says you're gone by Friday sundown." She held his gaze. "I don't have $5 to spare," she said. "But when I'm still here Friday, I'd appreciate an apology." The room went quiet, not the hostile quiet of before. Something more complicated than that. Pete's grin widened, because he was the kind of man who took silence as agreement. "Sure," he said. "Deal." She picked up her fork and went back to her food. What nobody at that table knew, and what she didn't say, was that her hands were shaking under the table. Not from fear, from the particular exhaustion that came from holding yourself together for so long that the effort itself becomes its own kind of weight. But she held it. She kept eating. She didn't let a single thing cross her face. Outside, the wind had picked up. Through the single window at the far end of the cook shack, she could see the sky had gone the color of old iron. "Storm," Virgil said, mostly to himself, looking up from his pot. "Coming in from the northwest." Nobody paid attention. It was just weather. The range got weather. But Mara looked at that sky for a moment longer than the others, and something in the quality of it, the stillness just under the movement, the particular shade of gray, lodged in the back of her mind, like a splinter she couldn't quite reach. She went to bed that night on the cot in the supply room, with every muscle in her body already protesting the day, and the wind working at the corner of the building, and $5 worth of pride and absolutely nothing left to lose. She was still there on Thursday. She would still be there on Friday. That at least she was certain of. Thursday came before Mara was ready for it. She had slept maybe 4 hours, which was 2 more than Wednesday, and 2 fewer than she needed, and she was awake before the bell, lying on the cot in the supply room, listening to the wind work at the eaves of the cook shack. It had not let up through the night. If anything, it had gotten meaner, lower in pitch, the kind of wind that didn't gust so much as press, steady and relentless, finding every gap in the walls and pushing through. She sat up. Her shoulders ached from the fence work the day before. Her right palm had a blister at the base of the ring finger that had opened sometime in the night and dried against the rough blanket. She peeled it free without looking at it and reached for her boots. The first 2 days had been a particular kind of trial she hadn't fully anticipated. Not because the work was harder than she'd imagined. She had imagined it hard, but because the shape of it was so unrelenting. There was no task at Redstone Ridge that was finished and then done. Every fence mended left 2 more waiting. Every trough filled ran low by afternoon. Cattle were moved and then needed moving again. The land absorbed labor, the way dry ground absorbed water, immediately and without acknowledgement, and you could look back at the end of a day and see almost no evidence that you had been there at all. She had been assigned to Hector Vela for the first 2 days, a quiet man of about 40, who had the unhurried precision of someone who had long ago stopped trying to impress anyone and had simply focused on doing the work correctly. He spoke rarely, and when he did, in short sentences with no decoration. He showed her things once, and didn't repeat himself, which she appreciated. He didn't comment on her pace or her size or her blisters. He handed her a heavier pair of gloves on the second morning without explanation, and when she said, "Thank you," he nodded and walked away. Pete Dalloway, by contrast, seemed to have taken her continued presence as a personal affront. He had not said anything directly to her since the supper table, but he had positioned himself nearby with a reliable frequency, close enough that she was always aware of him, often with one or two of the others in tow. He commented on her work at a volume intended for others, rather than for her the post she'd set that was supposedly an inch of plumb the way she coiled rope that apparently marked her as someone who didn't know what she was doing. Kept her face neutral, and her hands busy, and her mouth shut, which she understood was both the correct response and the most infuriating one she could give him. On Wednesday evening after supper, a man named Carver Jenks had sat down across from her at the long table while she was working a new blister with the edge of her thumbnail. Jenks was in his late 30s, lean as wire, with a face that had been in wind and sun long enough that it was hard to read. He set down his coffee and looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite friendly, but wasn't hostile either. "You're tougher than I figured," he said. Not a compliment exactly. More like a revised estimate. "I'm aware of what people figured," she said. "Pete's betting you'll fold tomorrow." I told him maybe not. She looked at him. "Did you bet against him?" Jenks smiled slightly, just enough to show he wasn't entirely without humor. "I'm a careful man with my money. That's not an answer." "No," he agreed, "it's not." He picked up his coffee and left. She turned that conversation over in her mind later, on the cot, listening to the wind. There was something useful in it, she thought. Not the words, but the fact of it. A man who had laughed in the yard on Wednesday was sitting across from her and revising his estimate on Friday. That was something. Small and with unknown cost, but something. Thursday morning she was at the corrals before Hector. Sky to the northwest was wrong. It had been wrong since dawn. A particular quality of gray that was not the ordinary gray of overcast, but something thicker, more deliberate, with a greenish tinge at the base that she associated from the one summer on her uncle's farm weather that meant what it said. She mentioned it to Hector when he arrived, pointing northwest. He looked. "Storm's been coming since Tuesday," he said. "This feels different than it did Tuesday." He looked again, longer this time. He didn't argue. He also didn't agree. He just said, "We work." And that was that. The morning was fence repair along the northeastern pasture, which put them directly in the face of the wind. It wasn't brutal yet, but it had weight to it, the kind of wind that made every motion cost slightly more than it should. And after 2 hours, her face was raw and her eyes were watering in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. She was driving posts with a maul, which was the kind of work that asked everything of your back and shoulders, and gave nothing back. And she was doing it without complaint, which she knew was being noted by at least 2 of the men working nearby. At mid-morning, Pete Dalloway rode up on a gray horse and watched her from the saddle for a minute without speaking. She kept working. "You got the angle wrong on that one," he said, pointing at the post she'd just set. She looked at it. It was straight. She had checked it 3 times. "It's straight," she said. "It's off." She turned and looked at him. "You're looking at it from a 45-degree angle, on horseback. Straight." Something moved in his face, a small irritation that he covered quickly with a broader performance of contempt. "Women," he said, to no one in particular, like it explained everything that had ever gone wrong in the world. He rode on. She drove the next post so hard the maul rang. Hector, 10 feet away, said nothing. But she saw, in her peripheral vision, that he did not look away from his own work, which she took as a form of solidarity. Lunch was hardtack and salt pork and cold coffee, eaten standing, because the wind had picked up enough that sitting was unpleasant. The sky to the northwest was darker. She kept looking at it. She wasn't the only one. She caught Hector's eyes going there twice, and once caught Milo squinting northwest with his hand shielding his gaze. Nobody said anything about it at lunch. Ranch hands, she was learning, had a particular relationship with incoming weather. They acknowledged it internally and ignored it externally until ignoring it was no longer viable. It was a kind of pride that she didn't quite understand and wasn't sure she should admire. By early afternoon, the wind had shifted from pressing to pushing, and the temperature had dropped 8 or 10 degrees in the space of an hour. Mara's hands had gone numb at the knuckles, and she was working them open and closed between tasks to keep feeling in the fingers. The cattle in the north pasture were moving wrong, not grazing, not resting, but drifting, the way animals drift when something in the air is telling them to find lower ground. She mentioned it to Hector. He watched the cattle for a moment. They'll settle. They're moving north, she said. Toward the canyon draw. He frowned. They know better than that. Something's pushing them. He looked at the sky again. The greenish tinge had deepened. The clouds to the northwest were moving faster than they'd been moving an hour ago, organized now in a way that had a kind of intention to it, rolling forward in a line that had definition at its leading edge. Hector said something under his breath that she didn't catch. He turned toward the ranch and whistled, sharp and carrying. The signal she'd learned meant get in, get moving. 3 of the hands started back immediately. Pete Dalloway, riding along the south fence line, wheeled his horse and headed in. Mara turned to follow, and then she stopped. The cattle that had been drifting north were gone. Not moved, gone. The north pasture, which had held at least 40 head as of an hour ago, was empty. She stood there for a second and counted the absence. North fence line, clear. East slope, clear. The draw at the top of the pasture, where the land folded down toward the canyon, the draw where the fencing had a gap she'd noticed that morning, and flagged to Hector as something that needed repair, was open. She grabbed Hector's arm before he rode past. The north herd, she said. They're gone. He stopped. He looked north. His expression shifted into something harder. Could be the east field. I just came from that direction. East field's empty, too. Check the draw, he said. And then his horse was moving, and he was shouting at the 2 remaining men to check the south pasture fence. Mara went to the draw. The tracks were there. She found them at the edge of the north pasture, near the gap in the fence she'd flagged, and they were clear, despite the wind-heavy hoofprints in soft ground, overlapping each other, heading down and north, which meant the canyon draw. The tracks were maybe 2 hours old, which meant the cattle had been moving before lunch, and she hadn't caught it in time, and that knowledge settled over her with a weight that was not quite guilt, but was adjacent to it. She followed the tracks to the draw's edge and looked down. The canyon below was a long, narrow cut in the land, steep-sided, maybe 80 feet deep at its deepest, with a creek running along the bottom that was already running faster than it should, fed by whatever weather had come through north of them. The walls were layered sandstone that crumbled at the top where erosion had worked at it. There were trees along the creek, cottonwood, and scrub willow, and she was almost certain she could see movement among them. She went back to Hector. He was in the yard now, along with Cole, who had come out of the main house with his hat pulled low and was listening to Hector describe the situation. Pete Dalloway was there too, and 2 others she'd learned were named Cass and Birdie. Canyon draw, Mara said, coming into the group without preamble. At least part of the herd went through the gap in the north fence. Tracks are 2 hours old, heading down. Cole looked at her. You sure? I'm sure about the tracks. Reasonably sure about the direction. Pete shook his head. That draw's not safe in this weather. Sandstone's already unstable. You get 30 head down there with a storm coming. You're not going to. They're already down there, Mara said. The question's what to do about it. Pete looked at her with the particular expression of a man who does not appreciate being corrected by someone he has decided is beneath him. The question, he said, is whether it's worth the risk. Cattle can be replaced. Men can't. Some men, Carver Jenks said, very quietly, from the back of the group. Nobody acknowledged this. Cole had gone still in the way she was learning, meant he was thinking, not checked out. He looked at the sky. He looked at Mara. You followed the tracks, how far? To the draw edge. I could see movement below the tree line. And the fence gap, north pasture, northeast corner. About a 4-foot opening. I flagged it this morning. Cole looked at Hector, who nodded. All right, Cole said. We don't leave 40 head in that canyon with this weather coming. He looked at Pete. Get your rope, Cass. Take the spare horses. He started toward the barn and then paused and looked at Mara. You know where the tracks lead? Yes. Then you're with me. Pete's expression went somewhere unpleasant, but he didn't say anything. What he did, as Mara turned toward the barn, was catch Carver Jenks's eye and say something low that she heard only the end of. Going to get someone killed. She didn't know if he meant her or the cattle or the whole operation. She didn't stop to find out. The ride to the draw took less than 10 minutes, but the weather changed twice in those 10 minutes, in ways that made Mara's chest tight. The wind swung hard out of the northwest, carrying the first real bite of cold that felt like it had come from somewhere much further north than the horizon, and the clouds moved in a way that was no longer gradual. The light went flat and yellow-gray, the kind of light that flattened distances and made it hard to judge depth, and she could smell moisture in the air now, not the fresh smell of ordinary rain, but something mineral and sharp. Cole rode beside her, not speaking, reading the land. He had a way of moving with his horse that was so habitual it looked effortless, and she knew from 2 days of watching that effortless was a lie, that it was the product of years so thoroughly absorbed that the effort had been folded inside the motion and was no longer visible. At the draw edge he stopped and looked down. The cattle were there. Counted what she could see through the trees 20, maybe 25 head, clustered near the creek bank, pushing against each other the way cattle did when they were confused and frightened. Creek had risen 6 inches since she'd looked an hour ago. At the base of the east wall of the canyon, a section of sandstone had sheared recently, the fresh break pale against the weathered rock face. "Rope the near ones first," Cole said. "Hector, take Cass down the south approach. It's less steep. Birdie, stay up top with the extra horses." He looked at Mara. "You ride down?" She looked at the slope. It was steep, loose-surfaced, and in the current wind, a horse that misjudged its footing could go sideways fast. "I can," she said. Honest answer. She looked again. "I can if I take it slow and don't push the horse." "That's good enough." He moved his horse toward the slope. She followed. The descent took longer than she wanted and shorter than she feared. Her horse, a solidly built bay named Quince, that Hector had assigned her for the afternoon, picked its way down with more sense than she'd given it credit for, finding the stable patches of ground by instinct, stopping twice to test its footing before committing. She kept her weight back, and her hands quiet, and let the horse work, which was the only correct thing she could do, and also the hardest because every instinct she had was screaming at her to do something. At the bottom, the wind was muffled by the canyon walls, which made it feel safer than it was. The creek noise was louder than she'd expected, a fast, continuous rush that told her the water level was still rising. Cole was already at the near edge of the cattle cluster, working his rope, making the low, even sounds that were apparently universal to anyone who had spent serious time with livestock. She moved to the opposite side and began pressing the outside animals toward him, which was the correct instinct and also happened to work. For 20 minutes, the operation went as well as it could. 6 cattle roped and moved back toward the slope. 8 more following without needing rope, simply moved by pressure and sound. The sky above the canyon walls had gone the color of a bruise. Then the east wall moved, not catastrophically, not all at once. Just a sound of deep granular shifting, like the earth clearing its throat and a cascade of small rocks from the upper section, and then a larger piece, roughly the size of a door, that broke loose and came down in a slow-looking drop that was not slow at all and hit the creek bank 60 feet from where Mara was standing. The cattle panicked. There was no other word for it. 40 pounds of social consensus evaporated in a second, and 30 head of cattle became 30 individual animals, each making the worst possible decision simultaneously. 3 bolted toward the slope and piled into each other. 4 went for the creek. The rest scattered into the trees, and the noise they made was enormous. Hooves on rock and earth, bodies crashing through willow branches, and over all of it the wind, which had found the canyon mouth and was pouring through it now with a sound like a sustained low note. Mara pressed her horse hard left to block a group of 4 that were heading toward the creek. Quince responded, but the ground was soft, and the horse's right foreleg punched through the creek bank mud to the hock, and for one lurching second, she thought they were both going down. Quince hauled itself free with an ugly sideways scramble, and she stayed in the saddle only because she'd grabbed mane and given up any pretense of good form, and when the horse straightened, she was breathing in short, hard pulls, and her heart was somewhere in her throat. She heard Cole shout something. She couldn't make out the words. She made out Hector's answer, "Man down." She turned Quince toward the voice. The man on the ground was Ray Tipton. She'd learned his name the evening before, a quietly built man in his 40s, who'd nodded at her twice and said nothing else. He was on the ground near the base of the east wall, not near the fresh break, but close enough that she understood immediately what had happened. A smaller piece of rock had come loose above him, maybe a few pounds, but at that height it had been enough. He was conscious. He was not standing. His left leg was folded in a direction that legs were not meant to fold. She was off Quince before she had a plan Ray. She was on her knees beside him. Look at me, he looked. His face was the color of old chalk. My leg, he said, I know. Don't try to move it. She looked up. The wall above them was making noise again, not dramatic, not a roar, but a continuous subtle settling that she recognized as a thing that preceded larger movements. She looked at the slope. Cole was at the top. She could see his silhouette. Hector was pushing cattle toward the slope from the south. Cass was somewhere she couldn't see. She looked at Ray. She looked at the wall. She did the math. Can you tell me where it hurts past your leg? She said. Everywhere, he said, mostly the leg. Anything in your back? Your neck? He thought about it, which meant he was more present than he looked. No, it's my leg and my shoulder. I hit my shoulder when I fell. Okay. She stood up and looked around. There was a cottonwood 20 feet from them, with a low-reaching branch, and Quince was standing where she'd left him, reins trailing. And from the top of the slope, Cole was shouting, something she still couldn't make out, but that had the quality of a question. She cupped her hands around her mouth. We need rope, and another horse. She couldn't tell if he heard. The wind in the canyon mouth swallowed everything. She went to Quince and stripped the coil of rope from the saddle. Not her rope. Technically everything on this ranch was the ranch's, but she'd had it assigned to her for the afternoon, and had carried it all day, and had not yet used it. And now she looped it twice around the cottonwood trunk, and considered the problem. The problem was that Ray Tipton weighed somewhere around 180, and his left leg was broken, and the slope was 60 feet, and the wall to their east was continuing its subtle, ominous conversation with gravity. She went back to Ray. I'm going to move you, she said. Going to hurt. He looked at her. How bad? Honestly, a lot. Okay. On 3, she said, and then moved him on 2, which was a trick she'd learned from her uncle when he'd had to move an injured calf, because on 3 people tensed, and it always went worse. Ray made a sound that she would not describe, and his hands found her arm and gripped it hard enough to leave marks, and she got him 3 feet before she had to stop and breathe. Above them, the wall made its sound again, louder. We have to keep moving, she said. I know, he said through his teeth. I know. She got him 6 more feet, then 10. Then she heard hoofbeats on the slope above and looked up, and Cole was coming down on his horse with a second rope, moving faster than was safe and making it work anyway, and she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. He reached the bottom and was off his horse in one motion. He took in the scene in about 2 seconds. Ray, the rope around the cottonwood, the wall, and then he was beside her without any commentary on what she'd done or how she'd done it. East or west, she said, meaning which side of Ray to take. East, he said. I'll take the weight. His left leg needs to stay as still as... I know he wasn't dismissive, just certain. Ready? Ready. What came next was not smooth. It was not well coordinated, because it couldn't be 2 people trying to carry an injured man across rough, unstable ground, while a canyon wall expressed its structural opinions, and a storm pressed in from the northwest was simply not a situation that lent itself to grace. Ray Tipton made sounds. Cole slipped once in the creekbank mud and went to one knee and came up swearing. Mara's arms were burning by the time they reached the base of the slope, and she couldn't feel her fingers properly inside the gloves. They got him there. Hector appeared at the base of the slope from the south, took one look, and understood without being told. He and Cass rigged a carry between 2 horses using their bedrolls and the spare rope, a field improvisation that she recognized as something learned rather than invented, and Ray Tipton was loaded onto it with more cursing and considerably less dignity than any of them would have preferred, and then the slow grinding work of getting him up the slope began. The wall made its largest sound yet, somewhere behind them. She did not look back. She looked up, kept moving. At the top, the wind hit her like a flat hand. She staggered, caught herself, and came to a stop in the north pasture, with the storm now fully visible on the horizon. Not a line of clouds anymore, but a wall, dark at the base, moving at a pace that made her stomach drop. Behind her, Cole emerged from the draw's edge on his horse, and then Hector with the carry rig, and then Cass, and then nothing but the empty sky above the canyon rim. The cattle that had made it up were already moving south, pushed by Birdie, who had stayed at the top and was now working the herd toward the main ranch yard, with the focused efficiency of a man who had done exactly this in exactly this kind of weather before. Cole dismounted and went to Ray Tipton, who was pale and barely conscious on the carry rig, and checked him with hands that knew what they were doing. Hospital's the call, Cass said. I know. Cole straightened. He looked at Mara. She was standing with Quince's reins in her hand, both of them breathing hard, the horse's flanks damp, and her own coat soaked through at the shoulders from the creek mud she'd knelt in without noticing. Her arms were shaking in a way she couldn't fully control, the particular tremor of muscles, asked to do more than they had budgeted for. Cole looked at her for a long moment. He didn't say anything right away. He just looked, and there was something in his face that she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because she was generally good at reading faces. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It wasn't surprise, though surprise was somewhere in it. It was more like seeing someone properly, she thought. For the first time, really seeing them. Get your horse back to the barn, he said. Get warm. It wasn't much. It wasn't the speech she might have hoped for in a weaker moment. But the way he said it, not to the group, specifically to her, with a directness that didn't have anything dismissive in it, was enough. She led Quince south, into the wind, toward the lights of the ranch yard. Behind her, she heard Pete Dalloway saying something to Carver Jenks, low and quick. She caught only 4 words. Shouldn't have gone down. She didn't know if he meant her or Ray or all of them. She kept walking. The first drop of rain hit her face when she was halfway across the north pasture. Then another. Then the sky opened. She walked the rest of the way in the rain and did not run, because there was nothing ahead of her worth running toward, and nothing behind her she was willing to run from, and because her legs were done with anything more than what they were currently doing. The barn door was open. The light inside was yellow and warm. Quince walked straight in and stopped at his stall, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rain come down on the ranch yard, on the corrals, on the cook shack and the bunkhouses and the main house up on its rise, where a single lamp burned in the office window. She was still there Thursday, and she was still there. She had not wanted it to feel like victory, but she was too tired to argue with herself about what it felt like, and so she let herself have it, just for a moment, in the yellow light of the barn door with the rain coming down, before she went inside to take care of the horse. The rain did not stop that night. Mara lay on the cot in the supply room, listening to it work on the roof, varying in intensity but never fully relenting, and she cataloged her injuries the way she'd learned to do, methodically, without drama, so that she could decide what needed attention and what could simply be endured. The blister on her right palm had reopened during the canyon work and would need wrapping in the morning. Her left shoulder, where she'd twisted it catching Ray Tipton's weight during the second carry, had stiffened into something that would make overhead reaching difficult. Both knees ached from kneeling in the creek mud. Her lower back was talking to her in the particular nagging way that meant she'd asked too much of it, and it intended to remind her of this fact every time she changed position. She wrapped the palm with a strip of cloth she'd torn from the hem of her spare shirt, turned onto her right side, and slept. She woke before the bell again, which was beginning to feel less like discipline and more like her body's refusal to let her rest past the point where rest felt safe. The rain had dropped to a thin, persistent drizzle. The wind had not dropped at all. She was at the corrals when Hector arrived, and he looked at her left shoulder with the professional eye of someone who had watched many injuries try to disguise themselves as fine, and said, "You favoring that side. It'll loosen up," she said. He made a sound that was neither agreement nor argument. He handed her a coffee tin that was still warm and turned to check the fence line without making anything further of it. That was Hector's version of concern. She had come to understand. Quiet, practical, and never prolonged. Cole had come out of the main house before breakfast. Ray Tipton had been taken into Harrow the evening before, on the supply wagon, accompanied by Cass, and Cole had received word by morning that the leg was broken in 2 places and the shoulder was dislocated, but that Ray was otherwise intact and would recover. The news moved through the ranch yard with the particular speed of information that people were waiting for, and she watched faces change when it landed relief, mostly mixed with the residual adrenaline of the day before that still hadn't fully worked its way out of anyone's system. Pete Dalloway heard the news standing 10 feet from Mara. He nodded once and said nothing. He did not look at her. The morning's work was damage assessment. The storm had taken a section of the south pasture fence and pushed 2 of the smaller storage structures off their foundations, enough that the doors wouldn't close properly. Hector directed the repairs with the quiet authority of someone who had done this many times and knew which problems were urgent and which could wait. Mara was assigned to the fence crew, which meant post-setting again, which her shoulder objected to for the first hour, and then accepted, grudgingly, as things loosened. Carver Jenks worked beside her for most of the morning without speaking, which was fine. Around mid-morning, he handed her a second maul without being asked, because the one she'd been using had a loose head that made the strike unpredictable, and she took it without comment and kept working. "How's the shoulder?" he said. After another 20 minutes. "Functional," she said. "That's not the same as fine." "No," she agreed. "It's not." He drove a post with 4 clean strikes, which was 2 fewer than she needed for the same size post, and she noted that without resentment because it was simply true. "What you did in that canyon," he said, not looking at her, was not a small thing. She kept her eyes on her post. It needed doing. Lots of things need doing. Not everyone does them. She didn't answer. She wasn't sure what the correct answer was, and she was wary enough of Carver Jenks, who had, after all, carefully declined to bet against Pete Dalloway, that she didn't want to say something she'd have to walk back later. He seemed to understand that her silence was not unfriendly. He went back to his own post. Supper that evening was the first real convergence of the full crew since the canyon, because the day before had been fragmented people eating in shifts, coming in from the rain, going back out. Virgil had made something that involved more beans than anything else, which was what Virgil usually made when he was either low on supplies or hadn't been told what to make, but there was also a pot of actual broth with something in it that had once been a chicken, and that elevated the meal considerably. Mara came in from washing up at the pump, her hair damp and her face stinging from the cold, and found the table arranged in a way that was different from the previous nights. The conspicuously empty end, which had been hers by default, was no longer conspicuously empty. Milo was sitting at that end, and he had left space beside him that was the ordinary amount of space rather than a statement. She sat beside him. He glanced at her sideways, then back at his food. "Shoulder?" he said. She was beginning to understand that shoulder was the canyon shorthand, the way people on this ranch referred to the whole of the previous afternoon without having to say everything it had been. "Getting there," she said. He nodded and passed her the bread without being asked. Pete Dalloway came in late again. This time he sat in the middle of the table, not the far end, which put him roughly across from Mara and 3 seats down. He filled his plate and ate without initiating anything. The absence of his usual performance was loud enough that several people glanced at him and then looked away again. Halfway through supper, Cole came in, which was unusual. Cole generally ate at the main house, or if he ate with the crew, it was early rather than late. He took a plate from Virgil without ceremony, found a space on the bench near the middle, and sat down. The table recalibrated slightly around his presence, the way rooms always did when the person with authority entered them. He didn't make a speech. He didn't address the previous day directly. He ate, and he participated in the ordinary conversation about fence repair and weather, and the anticipated cost of replacing the storage structure doors. And at one point he asked Milo a question about the eastern pasture water supply that led to a 5-minute discussion about pipe fittings. Normal. But before he left, he looked down the table at Mara and said, in the same tone he'd used for everything else, "Good tracking yesterday." On the herd, it was 7 words. The table heard all 7 of them. Pete Dalloway's jaw moved once. He kept his eyes on his plate. Mara said, "Thank you," because that was the correct response, and because she had learned the hard way that receiving acknowledgement gracefully was its own skill. And then Cole was gone, and the supper conversation resumed, and she sat with those 7 words in her chest and let herself feel them without apologizing for it. Splinter in the back of her mind, the one from supper on Wednesday, when she'd looked at the northwest sky and registered something wrong, came back to her that night. She was in the supply room, rewrapping her palm before bed, and she found herself thinking about the canyon not as it had been, but as it had been becoming. The east wall, the way it had moved, not just the large piece that had fallen, that had been dramatic and visible, but the continuous low-grade settling she'd heard underneath everything else. The sound of something that was not yet done. She also thought about the cattle count. Cole had said 40 head in the north pasture. They had brought out what she estimated as 32, maybe 34. In the chaos of the retrieval, she hadn't had time to reconcile the numbers, and afterward, with Ray Tipton's injuries, and the storm and the general exhaustion of the evening, she hadn't raised it. But lying on the cot now, in the drizzle quiet of the supply room, she counted again. 32, at most 34, which meant somewhere between 6 and 8 animals were not accounted for. She stared at the ceiling. The canyon draw, in the morning light, in post-storm conditions, with an east wall that had already shown what it intended to do, was going to be a different problem than the canyon draw in the storm itself. Different and arguably worse, because the destabilized wall would have had a night of rain working on it, loosening what the storm had already loosened, and anyone going back into it would be doing so with the knowledge of what the wall was capable of, and the additional knowledge that it had had more time to consider its options. She thought about saying nothing. She thought about it seriously, lying there in the dark, because saying something meant going back, and going back meant the canyon, and the canyon meant the wall. She was 26 years old with a broken blister and a stiff shoulder, and nothing except the next morning and the one after that, and she genuinely considered saying nothing. She was at Cole's office door before breakfast. He answered her knock still holding a coffee cup, and he looked at her with the focused attention of a man who had learned not to dismiss early morning visitors, because in his experience they arrived early for substantive reasons. She told him about the count. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he set down his coffee cup and said, "How sure are you?" "Sure enough to be here at this hour." He thought for a moment. "The east wall is worse this morning than it was yesterday afternoon," she said. "Has to be. A night of rain on already fractured sandstone." Yes. He wasn't arguing. He was thinking out loud the way she was beginning to recognize. Going back in. If there are 8 head down there, they can't get themselves out. The south approach Hector used is the only way in and out, and it would have been flooded overnight. They may not even be alive. She paused. "But if some of them are—" "We need to know either way," he said. "Yes." He was quiet for another 3 seconds. "I'll go. I know where the tracks went," she said. "You don't." He looked at her for a moment. "That shoulder is functional," she said. "I told Hector the same thing." "True both times." He picked up his coffee cup again, found it empty, and set it back down with an expression that suggested this was a metaphor for something. "All right," he said. "You, me, and Hector. No one else. I'm not pulling a full crew into that canyon with the wall compromised. We look, we assess. We don't take risks that don't need taking." "Agreed," she said. He looked at her steadily. "Mara, I mean that. If it looks wrong down there, we come back out." "I understand." She did understand. She also understood that what counted as wrong would be a judgment call made in real time by people under pressure, and that her definition of wrong and his definition of wrong might not be identical, and that this was a conversation neither of them was going to have right now, because they both knew it was unavoidable, and neither of them wanted to start it at 6 in the morning on an empty stomach. They rode out at first light, the 3 of them, and the ranch was quiet behind them, in the way of a place that was just beginning to wake up. Smoke from the cook shack chimney, a horse stamping in the near corral, Virgil's voice saying something inside the shack that was answered by silence. The north pasture was saturated. Every step left a mark, and the horses picked their way through the soft ground with the careful unhappiness of animals that preferred solid footing and were being asked to compromise. Sky was clearing from the southwest, pale blue showing between the last of the storm clouds, but the northwest horizon still held a line of gray that she watched with the side of her attention and did not trust. At the draw edge, Cole and Hector both stopped. She stopped beside them and looked down. Canyon had changed. The creek had risen to almost double its normal height, running brown and fast, carrying debris branches, uprooted brush, a section of old fence post that must have come from somewhere upstream. Cottonwood she had looped her rope around the day before had its lower branches in the water. The east wall, in the morning light, showed 3 new breaks that had not been there yesterday, fresh pale scars in the weathered sandstone, and at the base of the wall, a new debris field of fallen rock fanned out into the creek bed. But there were cattle. She could see 4, maybe 5, standing on a narrow shelf of rock on the west side of the canyon, above the creek line, pressed together with the motionless quality of animals that have stopped trying to solve a problem and are simply waiting. A 6th was lying down, which could mean anything. "West shelf," she said. "I see them," Cole said. Hector was looking at the east wall. His expression was the flattest she had seen it, which on Hector's face was a meaningful signal. "That wall is not done," he said. "I know," Cole said. "West approach. We stay as far from the east face as the shelf allows." He looked at Hector. "You come down after us with the rope. I don't want you on that slope at the same time as the horses." Hector nodded. Cole looked at Mara. She looked back. West side, she said. Understood. The west approach was less steep than the south and had better rock footing, which was the reason Cole had chosen it, and the descent was controlled even with the ground as saturated as it was. Her shoulders screamed on the third switchback when Quince lurched sideways, avoiding a patch of loose shale, and she absorbed it and kept moving, and the horse found its footing and continued down. At the bottom, the creek noise was overwhelming. Standing at water level, the canyon felt enclosed in a way it hadn't the day before, smaller, tighter, the walls higher, the east face more immediately present. She could see the fresh breaks clearly now, the raw stone, the pile of debris at the base. The wall was seeping in thin lines from the breakpoints, water working through cracks that the storm had opened or widened. She followed Cole to the west shelf where the cattle stood. Close up, the animals were in worse shape than they'd appeared from above. Two were showing the particular dull-eyed stillness of livestock that have been stressed past the point of ordinary fear and into something more fundamental. One had a gash on its right flank that had bled freely and dried, probably from scrambling over the rock shelf in the dark. The one that was lying down, when she got close enough, lifted its head and looked at her with eyes that were alert, if exhausted, which meant it was alive and probably not mortally injured, but had decided that lying down was the correct top response to recent events. She crouched beside it. "Come on," she said quietly. Not to convince it, exactly. But because talking helped, hers or the animals, it didn't much matter. "We're going to need you to stand up." Cole, behind her, was already looping rope on the nearest standing animal, with the practiced efficiency that she'd watched and studied for 3 days, without fully understanding how to replicate it. He worked fast and steady, and the animal accepted the handling with the resignation of something too tired to object. They worked for 40 minutes, getting cattle up a sloped canyon wall, while the opposite wall made periodic noises, and the creek ran hard below them, was the kind of work that couldn't be explained after the fact, in a way that captured what it felt like in the moment, because the moment had no narrative to it. It was just a series of immediate problems. This animal won't move. This rope is at the wrong angle. This footing is soft. That sound from the east wall is that bigger than the last one? And then the next immediate problem, and the next, the whole thing moving forward, not through any plan, but through the accumulated decisions of 3 people who were each trying not to be the one who made the last mistake. The lying down animal was the hardest. It had made its peace with the shelf, and no amount of urging was convincing it otherwise. Cole tried. Hector, who had descended after them and was working the upper portion of the slope, called down suggestions that were good suggestions and didn't help. Mara ended up behind the animal, both hands in its haunches, pushing, while Cole pulled the lead rope from the front, and the animal made its objections known in a volume and register that bounced off both canyon walls and came back doubled. And after approximately 3 minutes of this, it decided to stand, which it did with the aggrieved dignity of an animal that wanted it on record that it had had no choice. 6 animals up the slope, 5 more minutes of work, and they would be clear. The east wall moved. This time it was not preliminary. This time, the sound was immediate and large, a crack that she felt in her sternum before she heard it, and then a roar of displaced rock and earth that started at the upper section of the fresh break and came down in a mass that hit the canyon floor and the creek bank simultaneously and sent the creek water surging outward in a wave that reached the west shelf in 2 seconds and hit the base of the slope at knee height. The water didn't knock her down, but it hit her hard enough that she staggered, and staggering on a steep, wet slope with a frightened animal on a rope was the kind of compound problem that resolved very quickly. The animal bolted uphill, which was the correct direction, and the rope burned through her hands, and she grabbed it back on reflex, and the pull of the animal hauled her 3 steps up the slope before her left foot found a loose section of shale and went out from under her. She went down on her right knee and left palm, and the slope tried to take her. What the slope felt like in those 2 seconds was not dramatic. It was mechanical, a simple matter of angles and friction, and the available grip between her boot soles and the saturated rock, and none of those variables were in her favor, and she was moving, and she could not stop herself. Her right hand found something. She did not know what a root, a crack in the rock, something that held, and she gripped it with everything she had and stopped moving. She was sideways on the slope. Below her, the creek was running with the new debris from the wall collapse, brown and loud and very immediate. The rope was gone, had burned all the way through her hands when the animal pulled, and she'd had nothing left to hold it with. She could see the animal above her, making its own way up the slope, without any help from anyone, which under other circumstances would have been satisfying. Her right hand was burning where the rope had taken skin. Her left shoulder, which had been functional all morning, was now expressing a more urgent opinion. She looked up. Cole was 12 feet above her on the slope. He had come down 12 feet of slope in what must have been approximately 4 seconds, which was not a calculation she would have recommended, and which had clearly cost him. Because he was braced against the incline at an angle that looked temporary, his boots jammed against a horizontal crack in the rock face, one hand gripping the rock and the other hand reaching down toward her. 12 feet. She was 12 feet below him, and the creek was 8 feet below her, and the east wall was still moving. Smaller pieces now, the continuous cascade that followed the large collapse, and the sound of it was everywhere. "Reach up," he said. "I can't reach you," she said. The distance was real. 12 feet was 12 feet. The rope. He had a rope. She hadn't seen where it had come from. Hector, probably, from above, and Cole had it looped around his wrist and was feeding it down toward her. Take the end. She took her right hand off the rock thing she was gripping. For 1 second, she was held only by her boot soles and her left hand, and the left shoulder made a sound she didn't want to think about. And then her right hand found the rope end, and she closed her fingers around it. "Got it," she said. "Hold on," he said. "Don't try to climb. Let me—" She felt the tension come into the rope as he pulled, and then felt Hector's weight added to it from above, the two of them working the rope from the slope while she used her boot soles to walk herself upward, not gracefully, not in any way that she would have chosen, her shoulder burning and her palm bleeding again, through the rewrapped cloth, her left knee scraping rock hard enough to tear through the denim, the sound of the creek below her getting quieter as she moved, and then quieter still, and then not immediately below her anymore. Cole's hand closed around her wrist, not the rope. Her wrist, directly, his fingers all the way around it, and his grip absolute in a way that the rope was not. And she grabbed his forearm back the same way, and for a moment they were simply two people holding each other on a canyon wall, while the east face finished its collapse below them, and the creek ran brown and fast in the canyon bottom, and the 6 cattle they'd come down for made their way up the slope above them without anyone's help. "Up," he said. "Keep moving." She kept moving. At the top of the draw, she came out of the slope onto flat ground and immediately sat down because her legs had made a decision about this independently of anything she might have preferred. The sky above was the clearest it had been in 2 days, the pale blue of early morning pushing the last cloud line east, and the sun was coming through it at a low angle that put long shadows across the north pasture and made everything look temporarily simple. Hector was counting cattle. She could hear him behind her, the low murmur of his count, moving down the small cluster that had assembled at the top of the slope. Cole sat down beside her, not standing over her, not checking her from a professional distance. Sat on the wet ground with the damp immediately coming through his clothes, because that was the available option. He looked at her palm. The wrapping was gone, torn off somewhere on the slope, and the blister and the rope burn had merged into something that was raw and red and in need of attention that she didn't have the materials for right now. He didn't say anything about it. He also didn't look away from it. 6, Hector said from behind them. "All 6. All living," Cole said, without turning. "All living. One's got a flank wound needs looking at. Otherwise walking." Cole nodded. He looked out across the north pasture toward the ranch yard, which was a mile away and visible as a cluster of shapes in the morning light. "We'll walk them in slow," he said. "No rush." Then he looked at her. She was already looking at him. They were both sitting on the wet ground at the edge of the draw, with the canyon behind them, and the ranch ahead of them, and she felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was not a moment she was going to be able to fold up neatly and put somewhere later. It was too present. It was happening now, and would keep happening, the way certain things did. "You found them," he said. "Last night, the count." "Count was wrong," she said. "I just noticed." "You were the only one who noticed." She thought about the cot, the ceiling, the rain. The deliberate consideration of saying nothing. "I wasn't sure I was going to say anything," she said, and then was immediately uncertain why she had said that. Cole was quiet for a moment. "But you did." "Yes." He looked back toward the ranch. "That wall would have taken the rest of them," he said. "By tomorrow, that whole east section will be on the canyon floor. The ones we left yesterday would have been I know, she said. He didn't finish the sentence. She was glad he didn't. Hector brought the horses around, and they stood up, and she was stiffer than she had expected and made no effort to pretend otherwise, and nobody commented on it. They walked the 6 cattle south across the north pasture, at the pace of tired animals and tired people in wet boots on soft ground. And the sun came up properly as they walked, filling in the shadows, warming the back of her neck by degrees. At the entrance to the ranch yard, Pete Dalloway was waiting. She didn't know why he was there. He had no assigned reason to be at the yard entrance in the early morning, and she couldn't read his expression from 30 yards out. He stood with his arms at his sides and watched them come in, and when they were close enough, she saw that his face was doing something complicated. Not the contempt, not the performance of it anyway. Something underneath that, which was less organized and harder to name. He looked at the 6 cattle. He looked at Cole. He looked last at Mara, and he held that look for 2 full seconds, which was the first time since Wednesday that he had looked at her, without the contempt arranged between them like a piece of furniture. Cole handed his horse off to Birdie, who had appeared from the barn, and said to Pete, without ceremony, "Get Ray Tipton's bunk cleaned out. He's going to need it to recover in when he comes back from Harrow, and I don't want him sleeping on a dirty mattress." It was a task, ordinary, practical, nothing in it. But the subtext was unmistakable to everyone within hearing, which included Mara and Hector and Carver Jenks, who had materialized near the barn door. "You have a job to do. Go do it." Pete looked at Cole for a moment. Something moved across his face. Then he said, "Yes, sir," in a tone that was stripped of everything extra, and turned toward the bunkhouse. Mara watched him go. She looked at Cole. He was already moving toward the main house, talking to Hector about the water line to the south pasture trough, which had apparently been the next problem waiting in line. He didn't look back. She stood in the yard with the 6 recovered cattle spreading out behind her, and the morning fully arrived around her. The ranch waking up properly now, the cook shack starting up, voices from the bunkhouses, a horse testing the corral fence with its shoulder the way horses did. Her left shoulder was going to need a day, maybe 2. Her palm needed proper wrapping and something clean on it. Her knee had torn through the denim and the skin under it in a way that was going to be stiff by evening. She was, as of this moment, still here, still standing in this yard. And the yard was somehow different than it had been on Wednesday. Same buildings, same corrals, same horses and smell of cattle and turned earth and cook shack smoke, but different in the particular way that a place becomes different when you have paid for your place in it. Not paid in the way she'd imagined when she'd read the advertisement in Calverton. Not wages, not a transaction. Paid in rope burn and wet ground and the particular knowledge of what a canyon wall sounds like when it has made its decision. She was still standing in the yard thinking about this when Virgil leaned out of the cook shack door and said, without looking at anyone in particular, "Food's on." She went in and ate. The palm took 4 days to close properly. Mar wrapped it herself each morning with clean cloth she'd asked Virgil for without explanation, and Virgil had provided without asking, which was its own kind of courtesy. The knee she ignored after the first day, because ignoring it was the only available option. She couldn't take a day off the knee. There was no configuration of ranch work that didn't involve the knee, and by the 3rd day it had reached an arrangement with her that involved a dull baseline ache and nothing more dramatic than that. The shoulder she managed by adjusting how she lifted, leading with the right and letting the left follow, which was inefficient and occasionally obvious, but got the work done. Nobody commented on any of it except Hector, who watched her adjust her lift on the second morning and simply moved to her left side for the rest of the task, without being asked, taking the heavier angle himself. She didn't thank him out loud because she understood that thanking him out loud would embarrass them both. The week after the canyon was different from the week before it in ways that were both visible and not. The visible things were simple. The men sat differently at supper, the empty end arrangement having dissolved without announcement into something more ordinary. Milo passed her things without being asked. Carver Jenks had started including her in the practical conversation: fence conditions, cattle health, the ongoing question of the south pasture water supply, as though her opinions on these subjects were a natural part of the available information. Birdie, who was the youngest of the crew at perhaps 19 and had mostly moved through the background of the previous week with the careful invisibility of someone trying not to be noticed, started showing up near whatever task she was assigned to, and working in her vicinity with the transparent motive of someone who wanted proximity to a person they'd decided was worth being near. She found this touching, in a way she didn't know how to express without making it awkward. So she said nothing and let him work beside her, and occasionally corrected his post angles, which he accepted without resentment. The less visible things were harder to name, but she felt them constantly. There was a quality of attention in the yard that had changed. She noticed it first in small things, a pause in conversation when she came within earshot that was different from the Wednesday pause, less hostile and more uncertain, as though people were recalibrating in real time and hadn't yet finished. A couple of the hands she hadn't had direct dealings with, men who had neither mocked her nor helped her in the first week, started making eye contact where before they had looked past her with the practiced neutrality of people who hadn't yet decided. She caught one of them, a long-armed, quiet man named Stills, who mostly worked with the horses, watching her work from across the yard with an expression that was not unfriendly. None of this was comfort, exactly. It was something more provisional than comfort. It was the early stages of being taken seriously, which she had learned was not a destination so much as a continuous negotiation. Pete Dalloway was the complicated part. He had not approached her since the morning after the second canyon descent, when he had stood at the yard entrance and watched them come in, and something had moved across his face that she still hadn't fully decoded. He did his work. He said less than he had before, which was a significant reduction, and what he said was directed at the task rather than at the audience he'd previously seemed to require. He had cleaned out Ray Tipton's bunk as Cole had directed, and when Ray came back from Harrow on the fourth day, leg splinted, arm in a sling, moving carefully and looking like he'd lost a disagreement with a mountain, which was accurate. Pete had been the one to help him off the wagon and into the bunkhouse without being asked to. She watched that from across the yard and tried to locate what she felt about it, and found the answer was complicated enough that she left it alone. Ray Tipton was another matter. He came back from Harrow with the particular altered quality of a man who has had several days horizontal with nothing to do but think, and who has thought about something specific. He didn't look the same as he had before the canyon, not physically, though he obviously didn't, but in the face. Something had been rearranged there. On his second evening back, he came to find her at the corrals where she was doing the evening check on the water troughs. He walked slowly, which he would, for some time, the splinted leg obliging him to a careful pace that was clearly costing him in dignity, if not in pain. She saw him coming and kept working because stopping and waiting would have put something in the air that she didn't want there. He came up to the fence and leaned on it, taking the weight off the leg, and was quiet for a moment. "I didn't want to wait," he said. She looked at him. "To say something," he said. "I've been putting it together since Harrow. What I was told happened." He paused. "What you did." She turned back to the trough, checking the float valve. "Hector and Cole did most of it. They told me what you did before they got there." Moving me, he stopped. "I was in and out. I don't remember all of it. But I remember enough." She didn't say anything. The float valve was sticking slightly. She worked it with her thumb until it moved freely. "I wasn't one of the loud ones," Ray said, "first day. I wasn't one of the ones that I didn't say anything out loud." He paused again. "But I laughed." She knew this. She remembered exactly who had laughed and who hadn't. She had a precise memory for it, because that was the kind of thing her mind stored with particular care, the inventory of who had been where when it mattered. "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about that." She straightened up and looked at him properly. He was a plain-faced man, unremarkable in most features except for his eyes, which were dark, and currently carrying the weight of whatever he'd worked out over 4 days on his back in Harrow. He looked tired in a way that went past the physical. "You don't owe me anything," she said, not generously. "Factually, you were injured, I helped. That's what the situation was." "I know what the situation was," he said. "That's exactly why." She held his gaze. Something in the plainness of his face made it harder than she'd expected to maintain the distance she'd been keeping. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. Stayed leaning on the fence for another minute, not awkwardly, just resting the leg. "Cole's been different this week," he said, in a tone that shifted the subject without making a production of it. She went back to the trough. Different how? Paying attention differently. To the operation. To who's doing what. Ray was quiet for a moment. "He's always been a fair man. I've worked here 4 years. He's always been fair. But fair and paying attention are not the same thing." She thought about that. "No," she said, "they're not." Ray pushed himself off the fence. "Leg needs to go back in," he said, which was a way of ending a conversation that she respected for its practicality. He started back toward the bunkhouse, moving carefully. 10 paces he stopped and said, without turning, the south pasture water line. I heard them talking about it. The pipe joint at the second junction, it's not the joint that's the problem, it's the slope grade. Water's pooling above the junction and freezing in cold weather and cracking the fitting from the inside. Happened twice before I came here. Hector knows, but he's been putting off the regrading because it's a week's work. He paused. Thought you might want to know. He kept walking. She stood at the trough with this information and filed it in the same mental place as the northwest sky and the cattle count. The place where things went when she wasn't sure yet what they were for. Cole called the crew together on Friday morning. Not at supper, where announcements had the quality of theater, but in the yard, just after the morning bell and before the work assignments, which was unusual. She came out of the cook shack, still drinking her coffee, and found the men already loosely assembled, most of them looking as unclear about the reason as she felt. Cole came out of the main house and crossed the yard and stood where everyone could see him. He didn't clear his throat. He didn't say, listen up. He just started talking. We've had a hard week, he said. Lost fence, lost a storage structure, lost some cattle access we're going to have to work around, while that East Canyon wall finishes what it started. Ray's going to be off full duty for 6 weeks, which means we adjust how we're doing things. He paused. That's the operational part. Most of you already know it. He looked around the group. Nobody said anything. I also want to say something about the week that isn't operational. He said this the same way. He said everything else level, direct, no performance in it. I hired Mara Bellamy 8 days ago over the objection of several of you. I did it because the advertisement said no experience required, and she showed up and I made a judgment call. He paused. The judgment call wasn't about charity, it was about what I saw when I looked at her. I'm telling you now that what I saw was accurate. The yard was quiet. Mara was standing to the left of the group, slightly outside it, which was partly habit and partly because she'd arrived last. She could see Pete Dalloway directly across the loose circle. His face was the flattest she had ever seen it. She could not read it at all. What happened in that canyon, Cole continued, and after it, the second descent, the count she caught that nobody else did, that's not luck. That's a particular kind of attention to the work that is not common and is not something you can instruct someone to have. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not standing here to embarrass anyone. I'm standing here because this crew works better when everyone understands what's valued here. And I want to be clear about what's valued here, in case any of you have been unclear. He looked at Pete Dalloway. Not for long. Just long enough that it was unmistakable. Courage, Cole said, skill. Loyalty to this ranch and the people on it. That's what earns your place here, nothing else. Pete Dalloway's jaw moved once. He held Cole's look and then dropped his eyes to the ground. Not dramatically, just down. Cole looked back at the group. Assignments. Hector, fence crew south. Carver, I need you on the waterline situation. Talk to Hector about the junction grade before you start. I think we've been fixing the wrong thing. Bertie, the cattle from the canyon need their water checked twice today. The trough pressure's been off since the storm. Mara, he paused just slightly. Come see me in the office after assignments. He turned and went back to the main house. The group dispersed. She watched it happen, men, moving toward their tasks, the ordinary morning reassembling itself around the extraordinary 10 minutes that had just occurred. Carver Jenks caught her eye briefly, not smiling, just a small nod, like a door swinging an inch and being left there. Milo was already headed for the barn. Pete Dalloway walked past her. She didn't turn to watch him go, but she was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, a particular quality of alertness that his proximity produced. He didn't say anything. He was almost past her when he stopped. She waited. He didn't turn around. He stood with his back partially to her, looking at the middle distance, and the set of his shoulders was different from anything she'd seen from him in 8 days. Not smaller, exactly. More like something that had been held rigid, had been released, and the release had cost him. I was wrong, he said. Just that. Not loudly, but in the open air with 2 or 3 people still within hearing. First day, I was wrong. She looked at the back of his head. She thought about the yard on Wednesday. She thought about the cook shack, the $5 bet, the way his voice had been calibrated to carry. She thought about the canyon and Ray Tipton's face when he'd come to the trough, and the 4 words she'd heard Pete say when she was walking away after the first descent. She thought about what it had cost him to say 2 sentences in the open air. All right, she said. He walked on. She stood where she was for a moment. She wasn't sure what she felt. Not forgiveness. Exactly, forgiveness implied a cleanness that she didn't think the last 8 days had earned yet. Not satisfaction, because satisfaction would have felt tidier than this. It was something more like recognition, the acknowledgement of a thing that had happened and could now be placed correctly in the record. She went to Cole's office. He was at the desks this time, actually behind it, with a ledger open and a pen in his hand that he set down when she came in. He gestured at the chair across from him, which she hadn't been offered on the first visit, and she sat. He opened the middle drawer of the desk and took out a folded paper and put it on the desk between them without saying what it was. Picked it up and unfolded it. It was a contract. Single page, handwritten in Cole's close, sparse script. She read it carefully. Because she read everything carefully, a habit formed, understandings that the gap between what someone said and what a paper said was where most of the damage happened. The wages were more than she'd expected. Not extravagant, but fair in a way that signaled intent rather than obligation. The title was written plainly, in the same close script as everything else. Head of Cattle Operations, Redstone Ridge Ranch. There was a clause about housing, not the supply room, which they both knew was a temporary measure, but a room in the main house that was currently used for storage and would need to be cleared. There was a clause about the use of the ranch's working horses, which was a practical necessity, and also, she understood, a statement. And there was a clause at the bottom, added almost as an afterthought, that said the holder of this position was authorized to make operational decisions regarding the movement, management, and care of the ranch's cattle without requiring prior approval for each decision, subject to consultation with the ranch owner on matters of significant cost. She read that last clause twice. No woman has held this position, Cole said when she looked up. I know, she said. That's not information I'm offering as a warning, he said. It's information I'm offering because you should know what you're walking into. It won't only be my crew you're dealing with. When we go to market, when we deal with suppliers, when we're in contact with neighboring operations, there will be men who see your title and decide it means something other than what it means. I've been managing that since I was 16, she said. He picked up his pen, not to write, just to have something to do with his hands. I know you have. I'm not explaining it to you. I'm explaining it to myself, I think. Why this has taken me a week to get to, when I'm fairly certain I knew by Thursday what I was going to do. She was surprised enough by this that she showed it. What stopped you? He looked at the pen. The same thing that makes every decision on this ranch slow. I was trying to be sure. And with certain decisions, the more you try to be sure, the more you find you're just waiting for something to go wrong so you can justify being cautious. He looked at her. Nothing went wrong. The opposite. She picked up the pen he'd set down and signed her name at the bottom of the paper where the signature line was. Her handwriting was not elegant. It was the handwriting of someone who had been self-taught, functional, and clear, and nothing more. And she didn't apologize for it. She put the pen down and folded her copy of the paper and stood up. South pasture water line, she said. It's not the fitting. The slope grade above the second junction. Water's pooling and freezing and cracking the fitting from the inside. Regrading is a week's work, but it ends the problem. Replacing fittings is cheaper in the short run and more expensive by midsummer. Cole looked at her for a moment. Where did you get that? Ray Tipton, she said. Last night. Something moved in his face that was not quite a smile, but was related to one. He told you that. He thought I might want to know. Cole picked up his pen again and wrote something in the ledger. Tell Carver about the grade when you see him. I already told him this morning, she said. I told him you'd said to check with Hector about the junction, and I told him what to look for above it, so that he could make the comparison himself. Cole stopped writing. She waited. You told Carver, he said carefully, to verify the information himself rather than just taking it from you. Yes. Why? She thought about how to say this correctly. Because I've been here 8 days, and I'm about to be head of cattle operations. And if I walk in telling Carver Jenks how to fix a water line based on second-hand information from a man who's been off-site for 4 days, the first thing Carver thinks is that I'm either guessing or repeating things I don't understand. But if I give him the diagnostic question and he finds the answer himself, then he knows the thing. He doesn't just know what I told him. Cole looked at her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt the weight of it without being able to identify exactly what it contained. All right, he said. It was the same 2 words she'd said to Pete Dalloway in the yard, and she wondered briefly if he was aware of the echo. Probably not. Probably that was just the available response to something that had been said correctly. She left the office. In the hall, the iron-gray woman who had let her in on the first day was coming from the kitchen with a basket of linens. She stopped when she saw Mara and looked at her with the same expression of comprehensive unimpressibility that she'd had the first time. "The storage room," she said. "Second door on the right at the top of the stairs. I'll have it cleared by Sunday." "I can help clear it," Mara said. "I know you can," the woman said, and went on toward the stairs. Mara stood in the hall for a moment. She did not know the woman's name. She'd been there the whole time, moving through the main house with the efficiency of someone who managed it rather than simply worked in it. But introductions had not been offered, and Mara had not asked, because the timing had never been right. She made a note to ask. She made a note to ask properly, meaning not in passing but actually stop and do it. She went back out into the yard. The morning had fully established itself, the sun clearing the eastern ridge and hitting the yard with the particular low warmth of late autumn that was more comfort than heat, the kind of light that made even ordinary things look considered. Bertie was at the water trough, with a length of pipe and a troubled expression. Carver Jenks was heading toward the south pasture with a measuring rod that he hadn't had an hour ago, which meant he had talked to Hector and been given the rod, which meant Hector had immediately understood what to look for. When Carver had explained the diagnostic question, which meant Ray Tipton's information was right, and the problem was going to be confirmed within the hour. She crossed the yard toward the cattle pens to do the morning check herself. Pete Dalloway was working the fence on the east side of the near corral, replacing a section of rail that the storm had cracked. He worked with the quick efficiency of someone who had done exactly this task many times, and he did not look up when she walked past. She didn't stop. She didn't say anything. But when she got to the cattle pen and was doing the count, she was aware that she had walked within 10 feet of Pete Dalloway, and the air between them had not been what it had been a week ago. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't cleared. But it was different, and different in the direction of something that might eventually become workable, which was more than she had come to Redstone Ridge expecting. 41 head in the south pen, 28 in the east. The 6 recovered from the canyon were in the smaller holding pen, the one with the patched fence and the deeper trough, and she counted them by habit, even though she had been counting them twice a day since Friday. The one with the flank wound had been treated, and was healing without complication, because cattle were, in her limited but growing experience, more resilient than they appeared. She made her notes on the count tally she had started keeping in a small book she'd found in the supply room, a record of numbers and observations that didn't have a formal function yet, but that she intended to make useful. She had started 3 days ago, tracking not just counts but behavior, which animals were moving wrong, which were eating less, which seemed to be establishing themselves differently within the herd hierarchy. It was the kind of thing that took time to become meaningful, and she knew that, and she kept doing it anyway, because she had learned that most useful things took time to become useful, and that the only way to have the information later was to collect it now. She was closing the notebook when she heard boots on the ground behind her. Hector stopped at the fence beside her. He looked at the cattle with the practiced eye of someone who could read an animal's condition at distance. He was quiet for the first moment, which was Hector's standard mode of arrival. "Grade's wrong," he said. "Carver found it. Good. Weeks regrading work, maybe more with the ground wet." "I know," she paused. "Better than the alternative." Hector looked at her sideways. "Cole tell you yet? About the position?" "Yes." He was quiet for another moment. In the East Corral, Pete Dalloway hammered a rail into place with 3 clean strikes. "I've been on this ranch 11 years, Hector said. "I know what this ground costs. I know what it takes." He paused. "You don't know yet, not all of it." "No," she said. "I don't. You'll have trouble you haven't thought of yet. Men from other operations, market days. Some of the hands, when they hear it formal, some will be fine. Some won't. I know. I'm telling you," he said, "not to discourage you. I'm telling you, because you should know that I'll back you. Operationally, when it matters." He paused. "Hector Vela has not said that to anyone at this ranch except Cole Mercer." She looked at him. He was looking at the cattle, not at her. His profile was weathered and still and entirely serious. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just do the work." He pushed off the fence and walked back toward the south pasture. She turned back to the cattle and finished her count. The afternoon brought 2 things she hadn't expected. The first was a rider from the Castlewood operation 3 miles east, a man named Doyle, who was one of their mid-level hands, arriving with a message about a disputed water access on the shared property line. He was polite enough until she stepped forward when he asked who he should speak to about the operational matter, and then something shifted in his face that she recognized fluently. He looked past her toward the barn, then back at her, calculating. "I need to speak to whoever's managing the cattle operation," he said. Not rudely, carefully, in the way of someone choosing their words with precision because they wanted to leave themselves room. "It's me," she said. The calculation in his face continued for another second. "I see," he said. "Well," he produced the message and held it out, and she took it. He didn't offer his hand. She didn't offer hers. They regarded each other for a moment with the civil neutrality of two people who each understood exactly what was happening and had each decided not to make it a confrontation today. "I'll bring the matter to Mr. Mercer," she said, "and we'll have a response to Castlewood by end of next week." Doyle nodded. He turned his horse and rode back the way he'd come. She stood in the yard, holding the message and feeling the familiar pressure of that specific kind of dismissal, not hostile, never openly hostile, just the careful refusal to fully see you, the slight redirection of eye contact, the managed neutrality that was itself a statement. She had been managing it since she was 16, as she'd told Cole. That didn't mean it was weightless. She took the message to Cole. He read it, asked her 2 questions about the shared fence line that she answered from memory, and said he'd look at the property map and talk to her about it in the morning. She said fine and left. The second unexpected thing came at supper. Came in from the pump, still damp at the hairline, and found that the table had rearranged itself again. This time, it was not the end seat, not the default assignment of the person who arrived last to fill the remaining space. The seat beside Milo had been held not formally. Milos had simply set a coffee tin beside him, in the manner of someone marking a place, and across from it, in the spot that had historically been Pete Dalloway's performance stage, Pete Dalloway was sitting quietly eating beans and saying nothing to anyone. She sat beside Milo. He moved the coffee tin. He said, "The flank wound on the canyon cow looks better. I checked it this morning," she said. "It's healing." "Good." He passed her the bread. The supper conversation was ordinary. Fence work. Water line. The question of whether the cold weather coming next week would be worse than the cold weather of last week, which Bertie argued would be impossible, and Carver argued was inevitable. Hector ate without contributing to this debate. Ray Tipton, in his careful way, maneuvered himself onto the bench at the far end and ate with the focused attention of a man who was glad to be back at a table, even if the table was hard. At some point in the middle of this ordinary conversation, Pete Dalloway said, "To the table, not to anyone in particular, the East Corral rail's done. I reinforced the post below it too. The base had rot I found when I was in there. Should hold now." It was a sentence about fence repair. Functionally, operationally, that was all it was. She had done enough days of supper tables now to understand that this was also something else, a hand extended into the ordinary conversation in the manner of someone who has not been participating in the ordinary conversation and is signaling without drama a willingness to begin. Nobody marked it as significant. Carver said, "What kind of rot?" Pete answered. The conversation moved on. She ate her beans and her bread and her cold coffee and listened to the voices around the table, and what she felt was not triumph, because triumph implied a contest that had been won, and what this was didn't feel like a contest anymore. What it felt like was a room that had been arranged around an absence finding, slowly and with difficulty and without ceremony, a different arrangement. She was the absence that had been filled in. Or maybe she was the arrangement itself, she wasn't sure. She wasn't sure it mattered. Virgil came out of the kitchen with a pot of something that turned out to be a passable apple cobbler made from dried fruit, produced genuine surprise around the table, and a comment from Bertie that was either a compliment or an insult, depending on how you read Bertie, which Virgil received with the expression of a man who had been receiving Bertie's comments for 2 years and had developed a reliable immunity. She ate the cobbler. It was not remarkable. It was also warm and sweet, and the best thing she had eaten since arriving at Redstone Ridge, which said something about the week she'd had, rather than anything about Virgil's cooking. Outside, the wind had died. The first real stillness in 7 days had settled over the ranch, and through the cook shack window, the night sky was clear. In a way it hadn't been since she'd arrived Sharp Starsons. No cloud cover. The kind of sky that promised a hard freeze by morning and a clear, cold day after it. She thought about Sunday and the room at the top of the stairs. She thought about the cattle count she would do in the morning and the waterline report Carver would have by then, and the Castlewood message she would discuss with Cole after breakfast. She thought about what Hector had said at the fence. You don't know yet. Not all of it. He was right. She didn't. There was a whole expanse of this place and this work, and this specific arrangement of people that she hadn't seen yet. Because 8 days was not a long time, and she had spent most of it establishing the minimum, the baseline of survival on which anything else would have to be built. But the baseline was there now. It had been built in rope burn and canyon mud and cold rain and the specific arithmetic of a cattle count done on a cot at midnight. And it was not a baseline that could be taken from her, because it was not a thing that had been given. She finished her cobbler. She said goodnight to Milo, who nodded. She said good night to the table at large, which received various responses, and she went out into the cold and the stillness, and the stars over Redstone Ridge were extraordinary. The freeze came exactly as the sky had promised. Mara felt it before she opened her eyes, the particular quality of cold that had come through the window glass overnight and settled into the room like a second blanket, heavier than the first. She lay still for a moment and took inventory the way she did every morning, working through the roster of injuries that were healing at their own pace and on their own schedule. The palm, which had finally closed properly and was now just a tightness across the base of the fingers. The shoulder, which had settled into something that was no longer an active problem, but a memory of one. The knee, which complained on the stairs and nowhere else. 9 days of accumulated damage, compressing itself into the background, the way damage did when you couldn't afford to keep it in the foreground. The room at the top of the stairs was hers now. Margaret, that was the iron-gray woman's name. She had finally asked on Saturday morning, stopping her in the hall and doing it properly. And Margaret had offered her name with the same unsurprised efficiency she offered. Everything else had cleared the storage room on Sunday as promised, and Mara had spent 2 hours moving what remained into a more organized arrangement in the hall closet and another hour making the room functional. It was small. The window faced east, which meant it caught the early light, which she found she liked even when the early light was also cold. There was a chair, a washstand, a hook on the back of the door. The cot from the supply room had been replaced by a narrower but actual bed with an actual frame, which she had not requested, and Margaret had apparently decided was necessary without being asked. She had not thanked Margaret for the bed, because Margaret's expression, when Mara had looked at the room for the first time, with the frame in it, had been the expression of someone who considers thanks an unnecessary complication of a practical transaction. She got up, dressed, and was at the corrals before the bell. The freeze had done what freezes did. The water trough near the east corral had a skim of ice that cracked when she tested it with the end of a stick, thin enough that the cattle could break it themselves, but worth monitoring. The ground was iron hard in the flat sections and treacherous on the slopes. The mud of the previous week converted overnight into something that looked solid, and occasionally wasn't. She noted the trough. She noted 3 places on the path between the north gate and the south pasture where the frozen surface was uneven enough to turn an ankle, and added them to the small notebook. Bertie was right behind her, arriving at the corrals with his breath coming in small clouds and his collar up, looking very young in the way that people did when the cold got to them, before they were properly awake. He checked the south trough without being asked, and came back to report it had a heavier freeze than the east one. She told him to break it and check the float valve, which she was beginning to suspect was developing the same sticking problem as the trough she'd identified on her second day. He went to do it with the eagerness of someone who had decided that being useful was its own reward, which she found, in small doses, not unpleasant. Carver Jenks had been right about the regrading. It was more than a week's work. By the Monday of her second week at Redstone Ridge, he and 2 other men had been at the south pasture waterline every day, regrading the slope above the second junction in sections, while keeping enough of the existing system functional that the cattle weren't without water during the repair. The work was slow, and the frozen ground was not helping, and Carver had come to her on the Tuesday with an expression that was several parts frustration and 1 part professional respect, which she had learned was Carver's version of asking for input. She had gone out to look at the problem herself, which she understood was either the right or the wrong response, depending on how Carver read it. He had watched her walk the slope without comment while she worked out the grade with a level she'd borrowed from the main house tool cabinet and her own eyes and the accumulated logic of water, which always made its intentions clear if you watched it long enough. The junction needs to move 8 feet south, she said. Not the fitting, the junction itself. Everything you're regrading above it is going to pool differently than you expect because the south side of that slope has a natural dish that isn't visible from where you've been standing. Carver had looked at the slope for a long time. Moving the junction is 3 days of work. Moving it wrong is 3 days of work, plus the same problem in 6 months, she said. Your call. He had moved the junction. It had taken 4 days, not 3, and on the Friday of her second week, the water line to the south pasture ran correctly for the first time since, according to Hector, the previous spring. Carver reported this to Cole with the directness of a man who accepted the outcome without embellishment and did not volunteer the process. Cole had looked at Mara across the office, and she had looked back, and neither of them said anything about it, which was the correct response. The Castlewood water access dispute was less straightforward. She had gone with Cole to the meeting with Doyle's superior, a man named Prescott Chalmers, who ran the Castlewood operation with the confident authority of someone who had inherited both the land and the certainty that his interpretation of every boundary line was the correct one. The meeting was at the property line, which meant standing in a field in the cold, and Chalmers had brought 2 of his own men and a copy of a survey map that was 15 years old, and, she suspected, selectively remembered. Chalmers had looked at her once, when Cole introduced her as head of cattle operations, and then addressed every subsequent remark to Cole, which was a tactic she recognized and had prepared for. She let it continue for approximately 4 minutes, enough time to understand the shape of his argument, and then she unfolded the survey map she had pulled from the ranch records on Wednesday, not the 15-year-old version, but the one from 3 years prior, the one that reflected the creek's movement in the intervening decade, and placed it on the saddle of Cole's horse as a surface and said, Mr. Chalmers, the water access you're describing was correct. Under the 1,874 survey. The creek has shifted 11 feet southeast since then, which moves the shared access point to here. She put her finger on the map, which is currently inside the Redstone Ridge boundary. Your cattle have been using Redstone water for at least 2 seasons. Chalmers had looked at the map. He had looked at Cole. He had looked, finally and fully, at her, which was the first time. The survey I have, he began, is the 1,874 survey, she said. I know. We have both. She produced the 1,879 document from inside her coat, which she had folded and carried specifically for this moment, and put it beside the first map. The line of reference has moved. The math is not ambiguous. The silence that followed was the kind that contained a recalculation happening in real time. Cole, beside her, said nothing. She was aware of him the way she was always aware of him, peripheral, steady watching, and she was also aware that his silence was not the silence of someone who had checked out. It was the silence of someone who had decided she didn't need help with this part. Chalmers looked at the 2 maps for a long moment. Then he looked at his 2 men who looked at the ground, and then he looked back at Mara with an expression that was complicated in the way of a man revising a prior assessment under conditions he hadn't chosen. We'll need to discuss compensation, he said. 2 seasons of water access at the standard rate for shared creek use in Harrow County, she said. I have that figure as well if you need it. She did not produce that figure from her coat. She let the suggestion that she might be carrying it stand in the air between them, which was more effective than the document itself. Chalmers had agreed to a meeting in Harrow the following week to work out the formal terms. He had ridden away with his 2 men without further ceremony. Cole had watched him go and then looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the one that was not quite a smile, but was its direct relative. You had the rate figure? He said. I had a number I thought was probably close, she said. I wasn't certain. He had laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh, and it was brief and genuine and startled her slightly because she hadn't been expecting it. She filed it in the same mental place as everything else that was specific to this person. The list that had been growing since the first interview and that she hadn't yet decided what to do with. Ray Tipton came back to partial duty at the end of her second week. He couldn't ride yet, which limited what he could do, but he could manage the equipment inventory and the harness repair and the sort of stationary maintenance work that the ranch always had in surplus and never had enough hands to address. He did this with the focused attention of a man who was accustomed to physical work and found stationary work tolerable, only if he did it very well, and the harness she'd used on Quince came back to her, cleaned and repaired at 3 points she hadn't known needed it. She found him in the barn on the Thursday evening of her second week, working on a bridle by lantern light, with his splinted leg stretched out in front of him. "Castlewood resolved?" he said, without looking up. Word traveled on a small ranch, the way water traveled on a slope according to the available channels, and faster than you expected. "Meeting next week," she said. "Should resolve." He nodded. He worked a stitch through the leather with the patience of a man who had learned to be patient with the available options. "Chalmers is a difficult man," he said. "Has been in my experience." "He was manageable," she said. Ray looked up at this. He studied her for a moment. "Doyle came back this afternoon," he said. "I saw him in the yard. You didn't." She hadn't known Doyle had come back. "What did he want?" "Nothing official. I think he came to look." Ray went back to the bridle. "Men like Doyle need to see a thing a second time before they believe it was real the first time." She considered this. "Did he see what he came to look for?" "You weren't here," Ray said. "So he saw you weren't here, and that was the end of it." He paused. "But he asked Bertie, who actually makes the calls on the cattle operation." "Bertie told him you did." Doyle didn't argue. He just nodded and rode out. Ray set the bridle down and looked at her. "Bertie told me Doyle looked like a man working something out in his head. Not angry, just working it out." She didn't say anything to this. She picked up a length of spare leather from the workbench and turned it in her hands, checking it for cracking, which it didn't have. "You've been in this position 12 days, Ray said. "The men from the surrounding operations are going to keep coming to look. Some of them are going to be more difficult than Chalmers. Some of them are going to say things directly that Chalmers only implied." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you know it, and I think it helps to have someone say it out loud." "It does," she said. "Thank you." He went back to the bridle, put the spare leather down, and went to do the evening count. The first supper, where Cole seated her beside him, happened without preamble. It was a Friday, the end of her third week at Redstone Ridge, and Cole had come into the cook shack while everyone was finding their seats, an event that was no longer unusual, as he had been eating with the crew more often in recent weeks, a pattern she had noticed and hadn't commented on. He came in, took his plate from Virgil, and walked to the head of the table, which was where he sat when he ate with the crew, the seat that had the slight natural authority of being at the end, nearest the door, and therefore the easiest to get up from. Pulled out the chair beside his. He looked at her. She was standing with her own plate, in the process of finding a seat. She understood the gesture immediately, and she understood also that the room understood it because the noise level dropped by a perceptible amount in the 2 seconds between him pulling out the chair and her sitting in it. She sat, he sat. He poured coffee from the pot without ceremony. He poured a cup for her too, which was the kind of practical gesture that was easy to misread if you were inclined toward misreading, and she was not inclined in that direction, so she read it as what it was. Ordinary courtesy extended to the person sitting beside you. "Chalmers sent a letter this morning," Cole said, "to the table at large, because the Castlewood situation was ranch business, and the table was the ranch. He's agreed to the meeting terms. Mara, I'd like you to draft the formal response before Tuesday." "I'll have it Monday," she said. Carver Jenks, from the middle of the table, said, "What's the figure he's agreed to?" Cole said a number. There was a sound from several directions that was the collective reaction of men hearing an amount they considered fair and unexpected. Pete Dalloway, 3 seats down, looked at the number for a moment, in the way of someone doing the mental arithmetic of what 2 seasons of shared water access was worth, and comparing it to the number Cole had said. "That's correct," he said. "Not to anyone in particular. Just out loud. An acknowledgement of an outcome." The supper went on. She sat at the head of the table beside Cole and ate Virgil's beans and listened to the conversation, which moved through the waterline and the freeze damage, and the anticipated market date in late November, and the question of whether the south pasture would be ready to carry the additional load from the canyon cattle before then, and she contributed to the parts she knew and listened to the parts she was still learning, and the room that had once been silent around her arrival, and then hostile and then uncertain, was none of those things now. It was a room she was in. That was what it had become. A room she was part of, unevenly and imperfectly, and with history behind it that was not going to dissolve, but a room she was in. After supper, when the others were filing out into the cold evening, Cole stayed at the table. She stayed, too, not because she had been asked to, but because there was something in the quality of the room after the others left that suggested the conversation wasn't finished. Virgil moved around them, cleaning up, making the minimal noise of someone who had learned over many years to be present without participating. Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. He did this when he was working something out, she had noticed. Cup was a thinking object for him, the way the pen was in the office, not for its purpose, but for its presence. "You've been here 3 weeks," he said. 22 days, she said. He looked at her sideways. "You count." "I count everything," she said. "It's a habit." "The cattle records you've been keeping," he said. The small book. She had not shown him the small book. She had not hidden it either. "You've seen it. Hector mentioned it. I asked to look at it, and he said to ask you." Cole set down the cup. He said it wasn't his to show. She looked at him. "Hector said that." Word for word. She reached into her coat pocket and put the small book on the table between them. It was not much to look at a cheap notebook she'd found in the supply room, the cover soft from being carried, the pages filling up in the same functional handwriting she'd used on the contract. Picked it up and opened it. She watched him read. She watched his face move through the pages, the cattle count columns, the behavioral notes, the freeze conditions, the trough pressure records, the dates and numbers and small observations that had accumulated over 22 days of paying attention. She watched him stop at the page where she'd diagrammed the south pasture slope, the hand-drawn cross-section showing the grade and the dish and the junction position, which she had drawn on the Thursday before she'd talked to Carver, when she was still working out whether her reading of the problem was right. He studied that page for a long time. "You drew this before you talked to Carver," he said. "You were working out whether you were right." "Yes." He looked at the diagram for another moment. "And if you'd been wrong, then I'd have been wrong," she said. "I'd have told Carver to verify it, and he'd have verified that I was wrong, and we'd have fixed the fitting, and had the same problem in 6 months, and I'd have known not to draw the diagram from that angle again." Cole closed the book. He held it for a moment without giving it back, not keeping it, just holding it with a kind of deliberateness. "Why didn't you show me this?" "Because you hired me to do the work," she said. "Not to show you the work. If the work is right, the records follow from it. If the work is wrong, the records are just a record of being wrong." He put the small book on the table and pushed it back toward her. "There's a ledger in the office," he said. "A clean one. I'd like you to start transferring these records into it, formal format, as part of the operational record of the ranch." She looked at the notebook, then at him. "All right. Not because you need the validation," he said, as though he'd heard the thing she hadn't said. "Because in 5 years, when someone needs to understand why the South Pasture water line runs correctly, the record should exist." She picked up the notebook. Virgil, passing behind them with a stack of plates, said, without stopping, "Coffee's still on." Cole refilled his cup. He refilled hers. They sat for a while in the cleared table's quiet, and the cook shack had the particular warmth of a room that had been full of people and still held the residual heat of them. And outside the window the stars were out again, the way they'd been out on the night of the apple cobbler, clear and extraordinary. "My father built this ranch," Cole said. It was not something she had been expecting him to say, and she was careful not to respond too quickly. He built it and ran it the way he understood running it, which was the way his father had run things before him. Very few decisions that hadn't been made before. Very little room for the new thing. He paused. He was not a cruel man. He was a thorough man. "There's a difference." She waited. "He would not have hired you," Cole said. "Not because of cruelty, because of thoroughness, because the thing that had always been done was the thing that would be done, and anyone who didn't fit the previous category of the thing got redirected to where they fit." He turned his cup. "I've been running this ranch for 4 years since he died. Most of what I've done the way he did, not out of loyalty to it. Out of I didn't know what else to do, I suppose." She looked at the side of his face. He was looking at the window, at the dark and the stars. "3 weeks ago you walked into my yard," he said. "And Pete Dalloway said the thing he said, and the men laughed, and I heard it from the house. I heard it before I came to the door." He paused. "I stood inside for about 30 seconds before I opened it. She hadn't known this, I was deciding," he said. "Not whether to hire you. I'd already read the situation clearly enough to know I was going to talk to you. I was deciding whether to address what I'd heard before I opened the door, or to let it go and deal with it in context." He paused. I decided to let it go in context. I don't know if that was right. She thought about the yard. She thought about Pete Dalloway and the long carry of what came after. Context took 3 weeks, she said. Addressing it directly might have taken 3 days. Yes, he looked at her. That's what I've been thinking. But 3 days wouldn't have told you what you know now, she said. It wouldn't have told Pete what he knows. It wouldn't have told Ray or Carver or any of them. No, he said, but it would have cost you less. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind moved through the yard and was gone. I didn't come here to be comfortable, she said. I came because it was the only position I could find that was honest about what it required, and didn't pretend the requirements were something other than work. She paused. The cost was the cost. It was mine to pay. Cole looked at her for a long time. She didn't look away, and he didn't either. And the room was quiet, except for Virgil putting things away in the kitchen, with the steady, quiet efficiency of a man who had been doing his job a long time. You didn't prove you belonged here, Cole said. His voice was level and certain, in the way of someone who has arrived at a thing they've been working toward without knowing they were working toward it. You showed us what this place was missing. She received this. She received it fully, without deflecting it, without undercutting it, without doing the thing she usually did with acknowledgement, which was to immediately redirect it toward the practical. She let it sit in the room and be what it was. The ledger in the office, she said after a moment. I'll start on it Monday. He nodded. He finished his coffee. He stood and took his cup to the kitchen where Virgil took it from him without comment. And he put his coat on and went to the door and stopped. There's a market in Harrow in November, he said. It's the first major one since late summer. The other operations will be there. Chalmers and several others. He paused. I'd like you to manage the Redstone Ridge presentation. Not alongside me as the lead. She understood what this meant. The market in Harrow was not just a transaction. It was a public thing with the region's ranchers and their crews, and it carried the social weight of any public declaration. All right, she said. He went out into the cold. She sat at the table with her coffee cooling in the cup and thought about the market in November and the look on Doyle's face when Bertie had told him who made the calls, working it out. She thought about Chalmers and the 2 survey maps and the number that was correct. She thought about the things that were still ahead, the men from other operations she hadn't met yet, the ones who would be worse than Doyle or more strategic than Chalmers, the days that would be harder than the canyon, and the days that would be harder than those, the accumulated difficulty of being in a position that was new, not just to her but to the land itself, the people on it, the idea of it. She thought about what Hector had said. You don't know yet. Not all of it. He was still right. She still didn't. She thought she probably never would, completely. The knowing was always going to be behind the doing, scrambling to catch up, and that was the nature of work that mattered. The work didn't wait for you to understand it before it needed doing. You did it and understood it afterward, and then it changed, and you did it again. She had known this at 16, leaving her aunt's house with nothing. She had known it at 23, working the laundry floor in Calverton, in conditions that were tedious and sometimes cold and never quite enough. She had known it standing in the yard of Redstone Ridge, with Pete Dalloway's voice carrying across the open air, and every pair of eyes in the place deciding what she was before she'd opened her mouth. The knowing wasn't the point. The doing was the point. The getting up before the bell, and checking the troughs, and flagging the bad fence, and following the tracks into the draw, and moving when the wall fell, and counting the cattle at midnight on a cot in the supply room, not because anyone asked her to count, but because the number was wrong, and wrong numbers mattered. Point was that she had never once waited for the circumstances to improve before doing the work. She had done the work inside the circumstances. However, the circumstances were arranged, and the circumstances had eventually rearranged themselves around the fact of that. This was not, she thought, a lesson that could be taught. It was a thing you either had or you worked your way into, usually through the particular education of having nothing else available. She was not glad she had had nothing else available. She was not going to construct a story in which the hard years were secretly a gift. They were hard years, and they had cost her things she would have preferred to keep, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she was also here. That was also true. Virgil came out of the kitchen and looked at her still sitting at the table. He picked up the coffee pot, found it mostly empty, and poured the remains into her cup without being asked. You staying all night? He said. No, she said. He took the pot back into the kitchen. She heard him moving around in there, the ordinary sounds of a man closing up for the night. She sat with the last of the coffee and let the week settle around her, the way weeks did when you finally stop moving, the full weight of what had been done and what was coming. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a rented horse in this yard 22 days ago with $11 and a folded advertisement and 200 miles of road behind her and nothing in front of her that was guaranteed. She thought about that woman with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite admiration, but had elements of both, a kind of recognition, the way you recognize someone you had been before you became the thing you were currently trying to be. That woman had been frightened. She hadn't shown it, because showing it would have cost her the only thing she had, which was the appearance of someone who was not frightened. But the hands had been shaking under the table at supper, and the cot in the supply room had felt like the narrowest possible ledge, and the $5 bet had been the only thing between her and the full reality of what it meant to have nowhere to go if this one didn't work. She was still that woman. She was not going to pretend that 3 weeks, and a signed contract and a room at the top of the stairs had transformed her into someone who was not also, underneath everything, a woman who had spent her life being redirected to where she fit. That was in her. It would probably always be in her. The difference was that it no longer had veto power. She got up. She put on her coat. She went to the kitchen door and said goodnight to Virgil, who said goodnight back in the tone of someone who had been waiting for this, and she went out into the cold. The ranch yard at night was a different place than it was in the day. The shapes of things, the barns, the corrals, the bunkhouses, the main house up on its rise, were simplified by the dark into their essential forms, and the stars above them were the same stars she'd looked at the night of the apple cobbler, and the night of her first day, and every night in between, and they were still extraordinary. She stood in the yard for a moment, not for any practical reason, just to stand in it. From the bunkhouse, she could hear voices, Bertie's and Milo's, something about cards. The main house had a lamp in the window of Cole's office, which she had noticed was often the last light on the ranch to go dark. The barn had its own quiet, the specific settled sound of horses at rest. She breathed the cold air and felt the yard around her, not as a place she had survived, though she had survived it, but as a place she was in. Continuously, concretely, by the work of her own hands, and the stubbornness of her own will, and the help of people who had come to her in the particular practical ways of people who did not easily say what they meant, but found other ways to say it, who handed you gloves without explanation and moved to your left side on the heavy lifts and held the rope above you when the slope was taking you, and stayed at their station and came around by degrees. Hector was right that she didn't know it all yet. She had 22 days of this ground under her feet, and an enormous amount of it still ahead of her, seasons she hadn't seen, problems she hadn't imagined, the long learning of a place that had existed before her and would exist after, and was only now, carefully and with difficulty and without ceremony, beginning to include her in its idea of itself. There were people who would have said this was enough. There were people who would have made the signing of the contract the end of the story, the moment of arrival, after which everything resolved into something easier. But she was standing in a ranch yard at night with cold air in her lungs and 22 days of work in her hands, and she understood that arrival was not a destination. It was a beginning that came dressed as an ending, and the only way to know the difference was to still be there the next morning. She would be there the next morning. She turned and walked toward the main house, toward the stairs and the room with the east-facing window, and her boots on the frozen ground made the only sound in the yard for a while, clean and solid, the specific sound of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. In the morning, she would be up before the bell. She would check the east corral trough. She would make a note in the small book about the freeze conditions and start thinking about what a hard winter would mean for the cattle in the north pasture and what adjustments to the rotation would give the south pasture. Grass enough time to recover before the spring drive. She would begin drafting the response to Chalmers. She would find Hector and talk about the market date and what the Redstone Ridge presentation should look like, and what, specifically, she needed to know that she didn't know yet. There was a great deal she didn't know yet. She intended to learn it. The lamp was still on in Cole's office window. She came into the house. She stood in the hall for a moment, aware of the light under his door, aware that he was still working the way he always was at this hour. She thought about the coffee cup he turned in his hands, and the 30 seconds he'd stood inside the door before he opened it, and the way he'd laughed, briefly, genuinely, standing in a field with the Chalmers situation resolved around them. She went upstairs to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots and set them by the door and lay back on the narrow frame and looked at the ceiling that was hers now, at least in the way that things became yours when you'd paid for them honestly, with something that mattered. The east window would have light in it in 4 hours. She intended to be awake for it, not because the work demanded it, though the work always demanded it, but because she had learned, over 22 days at Redstone Ridge, that the early light on the yard was the moment when the whole place was most itself, before the noise and the difficulty and the accumulated weight of what needed doing. There was just the ground and the sky and the shapes of things in the first light, and in that moment it was possible to see clearly what you were part of and understand why it was worth the cost. That was the thing nobody told you about belonging somewhere. It wasn't the moment of arrival, and it wasn't the signed contract, and it wasn't even the people coming around, though all of those things mattered. It was the particular morning when you woke up. The place was already in you before you were fully awake, its sounds and its needs, and its geography embedded in you, the way things embedded themselves when you had given them enough of your time. And your effort and your honest attention that the relationship ran in both directions. She wasn't there yet. She was close. She would be closer in the morning. She closed her eyes, and the cold came through the window glass, with the specific quality of late autumn on the high range, and the stars outside were still there, even if she couldn't see them. And Redstone Ridge settled around her into the deep particular quiet of a place that has finished one version of itself and is deciding in the dark what it will be next.